If you come into this application and start playing around with the different input controls and watch the data structure for the form on the right-hand side, you'll start to realize that one of these inputs is not like the other. Specifically, the rating directive that we built in a previous module doesn't integrate with a form at all. If I look through the data structure right now, I would not find an entry for rating. If I change the rating on a pristine form, the dirty flag doesn't change. And all of this is because when we implemented this rating control, we really didn't have a form in mind, but quite often this might be the type of control or type of directive that you do want to have integrated into a form. You might want it to work with validation rules. You might want it to turn the form dirty. And so what I'd like to do is show you how to update our rating directive so that it works with a form, and more specifically with ngModelController. Because if you want a directive to integrate with a form, you'll either need to talk to the form controller, but more likely you'll need to talk to an ngModelController, because it's really ngModel that's responsible for registering the different inputs that are inside of here, like username. So let's swing over into our code, and the first thing I'm actually going to change is the markup. Because currently we are using an attribute value to establish the two-way data binding between what we're displaying and what's going to be in the model. But it would be more appropriate on a form to use the same directive that all the other input controls use, which is ngModel. And now what my rating directive will have to do is talk to the ngModelController, and that just means down here in my require statement, in addition to OTF rating, I'm also going to need ngModel. It should be on this same DOM element. And I'm going to rely on ngModel to get and set values, so I no longer need an isolated scope with a value inside. I still want an isolated scope because I'm going to be adding things to it. I don't want that to interfere with the parent. So I'll still have an isolated scope, just no automatic two-way binding between myself and value. Instead, I'm going to rely on ngModelController to do that. And now since I have two controllers listed in my require, I no longer get a single controller to my linking function. I get an array of controllers, and I will have to dig these out. So the rating controller will be controllers sub 0, because that is the first controller that I ask for in require. And the ngModelController will be the second controller in that array, so sub 1. And now anytime you have an OTF rating, it will require ngModel. And down here, where I used to say controller.setRange, this is really rating controller. And I need to get ngModelController into my rating controller. So it might make more sense to call this something like initialize instead of set range and pass in ngModelController. So now let's make changes to the code above based on those changes. Instead of set range, I have an init. This will take ngModelController. And so that I have access to that throughout all the other methods that I have defined here inside of the constructor function for the controller, let me just declare a local variable ngModel. And I will say that ngModel equals ngModelController. So what do I have to do with ngModel? Well, one thing I need to do is I need to set up a render method. I actually need to attach that to ngModelController, and I'm going to point it to a function that is a member of my controller. So this.render is a function. And the whole idea behind render is that Angular is going to call render at the appropriate times when you need to take a value from ngModel and make sure that it is properly rendering in the DOM. Now, quite often that means DOM manipulation, but we have everything set up in this directive to work off scope.value. So it's scope.value that determines what stars are lit up, what stars are empty. And so all I need to do inside of a render method is simply say that scope.value equals ngModel.viewValue. So ngModel will hold the value that needs to appear in the view. I just need to ask for it by going to $viewValue and then putting it into my scope or manipulating the DOM so that it appears on the screen. All I have to do here to light up the stars is just set scope.value. And on the other end, I need to update that view value when the user changes something, when they click on something. So instead of setting my own scope.value, that's going to happen during rendering, I'm going to tell the ngModelController to set a new view value that is equal to index +1, and I can tell it that this has been touched. And in this case, I can also force ngModel to render and push that into my own scope. So let's save all this and come back to our form. I do just want to point out that if I do a search for rating, it doesn't appear in the data structure anywhere. I only have one match, and that is the label here. But now if I refresh the application, I now have rating. I can set that rating. If I go looking in the data structure, I will now see that rating appears here. I can see it has the proper view value, the proper model value. I can see it has been touched. It's no longer pristine. It's dirty. And that all happens just because I'm interacting with ngModelController in the appropriate fashion. If I had validation rules associated with the rating, I could also have properties appear on $error here, and things would turn valid and invalid. But since we're talking about validation rules, let's take a quick look at building a custom validation directive next.